What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for the System Shock 2 25th Anniversary Remaster, which just so happens to also be my first time playing the game after checking out System Shock 1 via its relatively recent remake, so plenty of stuff to go over. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. But in the case of this game, a couple things to mention. This review should be going live right as the game itself releases over on Steam. I believe the console date got pushed a little ways, just so you know. That is of course possible because I was provided a review copy for this game ahead of time. What's more, speaking of that review copy and some of the achievements for the 100%, because this is one of those games that's been out forever, its original release being in, I believe, 1999, everything's been pretty well sorted out for this for many years. As a remaster, this game is functionally that original game, but obviously made a little more modern, meaning that none of these achievements are particularly difficult to obtain, but they are a little bit wonky, I guess would be the way to put it. I was able to get all of them to work. You can even see the sort of in-game achievement menu here with all of them unlocked, but a couple of noteworthy ones. So there's a really easy one called Redirected, where you just use a psi power to pull an item towards you via telekinesis. It looks like if you play the game as an OSA agent, which I'll explain here in a bit, something about not having to unlock that ability but rather starting the game with it seems to prevent that achievement from working. And so despite it being really easy, I didn't get it on my first playthrough because I was playing with an OSA agent after initially just thinking it was bugged. Another instance of this, there is an achievement where you have to kill an enemy while invisible, with the sort of caveat being that being invisible typically results in you being not invisible as soon as you attack something, but there's a workaround with a pyrokinesis power. I also thought this one was bugged because when I did the exact task, the achievement didn't pop until like 15 minutes later. Not really sure what that was about. And what's more, there was even one achievement that popped when I had not done the thing. So there's an achievement for killing a stunned enemy who has been stunned by a specific weapon that you can pick up, and I had not stunned an enemy when that achievement popped. But long story short, they should all work, they're just a little odd. Now let's go ahead and talk about the game itself. As this was my first experience with System Shock 2, I would say, broad strokes, wow, I can see why people were really into this game. In fact, playing this in 1999, I would have to have assumed this felt way ahead of its time back then. Some parts of it are definitely janky and odd, to be sure, as you would probably expect with any title that is ultimately based on a 20-plus-year-old game. If you're willing to get past that stuff, there really is just a fantastic experience here with some fantastic voice acting. Although admittedly some of the voice acting is not stellar, but most of it is. And while it's a relatively short and sweet experience, my first playthrough was about 13 or so hours, and the subsequent run-throughs, where I knew where everything was and what to do and whatnot, were about 6 hours each. It really does make tremendous use of that time, really just with all of it being packed full of really interesting stuff that keeps you on your toes and engaged in the experience without ever feeling like it runs on too long. And again, simply put, I can see why people enjoyed this game so much and it was so much of a cult classic. But coincidentally, while the people who played it loved it, System Shock 2 on its initial release was actually a bit of a commercial flop. It only sold like 60,000 copies at the time, which means there's a not insubstantial chance that people will be playing this for the first time. And to that end, I did consider trying to keep this largely spoiler-free, but it occurred to me while I was attempting to do that literally the cover art for the game is in and of itself kind of the main spoiler. So as a result of that, I'm just not going to bother with that, and thus, if you want to go into this spoiler-free, probably not the review for you, to be frank. And I would actually recommend that you go into your first playthrough blind just to enjoy things, as I really do think it's a great experience that is worth that time investment. Let's keep it rolling though. Let's talk technical details. How is this game running? What's some of the stuff added by the remaster specifically? What's it all about? That kind of thing. So as far as problems go, I just didn't really have any outside of problems that are due to the game's age more so than anything else. But it ran well, no crashes, anything like that. Mostly just a lot of minor nuisances. Interactions with objects being a little bit weird, like the way you climb up and down ladders in this game is rudimentary at best, and sometimes can lead to you falling even though you are clearly on the ladder. Sometimes when you have to jump off of a ladder, your character refuses to move forward, resulting in you potentially falling to your death in some instances, and that's just really because it's a remaster of such an old game more than anything else. Now let's talk about that remaster though. What exactly is the deal here? What is it bringing to the table? Why play this? So first and foremost, you got fully operational co-op multiplayer, which is also cross-play. That is to say, you should be able to play it with pretty much anybody on any system. It also brings a little more direct mod support, with there being a mod menu for you to activate when you start up a game. There's obviously all of the modern PC support in terms of things like ultra-wide screens, making sure it runs on modern hardware without having to jump through hoops, other little quality of life enhancements, and of course updated visuals, with the aim there being mostly to keep the experience intact while also making it a bit more playable as a result. Next up, let's talk difficulty. So we've got basically easy through impossible. Everything difficulty affects is primarily down to your own health and psi points alongside the cost of upgrades. Pretty much everything else remains the same. When I was playing on impossible difficulty, I did notice that a couple of items and things had been moved around, and I'm not sure if that was like a bug or anything or if it was intentional. But if it was intentional, it was really minor anyway, so I'm not exactly sure. Ultimately, though, basically it's just easier for enemies to kill you the higher the difficulty goes, but the enemies and everything all remain the same. Now, from there, let's talk about, I guess you could call it character creation, perhaps put some quotation marks around that, but one really cool thing about System Shock 2 that I liked a lot is that the intro to the game is actually you deciding what kind of character you'd like to start the game as, either a Marine, a Navy officer, or an OSA agent. Now, what this actually amounts to is the types of skills that you will have inherently versus what you have to branch into and upgrade for. Now, straight up, the easiest option is the Navy. They get initial access to some very clutch skills that are, I would say, the most welcoming to new players. But of course, all of these are more than accessible, especially once you've played through the game at some point. So the Marine primarily focuses on weapons and stats. The Navy character, and the reason I recommend them is because they can get access to things like repair and stuff that will make the early game much, much easier for you. Whereas the OSA agent is going to get default access to some of the psi powers or psychic abilities. These can be really fun and some of them are ludicrously overpowered, but it can take a little more work getting this character ready to go, frankly. This is actually the character I started the game with because it sounded the most interesting, but it did make my first playthrough needlessly more difficult than it should have been, so I don't know that I would recommend people start there. But I do like that they give you options, but important to mention that this is literally just a starting point. You can branch into everything else, and it doesn't fundamentally change the plot or interactions or anything like that. Probably the coolest thing about it, though, is that the skills you choose to specialize in this are done by, like, choosing little missions to go on, which define your character, which, ultimately meaningless, but a fun little bit of initial role-playing that wasn't really necessary, and as such is a welcome little addition. From there, let's talk about the story and my thoughts on it. Just a little reminder, absolutely going to be spoiling stuff here, but let's get to it. So, I believe it's like 42 years after the original System Shock, the company, Trioptimum, was nuked into the ground illegally, only to be resurrected by Anatoly Kurinchkin, who slowly, over the period of about 14 years, rebuilt the company up from the ground, having turned things around and using that opportunity to actually develop the world's first faster-than-light ship, the Von Braun. On the Von Braun's maiden voyage, it will be accompanied by UNN soldiers, a military organization brought in to essentially reel in all of these corporations, and their ship, the Rickenbacker, will be piggybacking onto the Von Braun in order to keep things safe. You will be, through your starting position, joining that team. However, probably as you would expect, things go wrong pretty much immediately. We wake up on the ship with no memory of what actually happened prior to this, with the ship already having fallen to pieces, basically. There are hybrid mutants everywhere, killer robots, you name it. Now, initially, you're contacted by a woman named Polito who is guiding you through the various decks of the ship as you try to make your way to her, so you can get to the bottom of what they call the Mini. Basically, these hybrid organisms that have been infesting humans and using their biological processes to further their own ends are in fact one collective hive mind organism known as the Mini. Except when you finally get to Polito, you find out, as the cover art would have almost certainly told you, and the fact that the title is System Shock, and if you've played the first one, you know where this is going, Polito is dead, actually. A malevolent AI known as Shodan, or Shodan if you prefer, but I'm going to say it in a way that's comfortable for me, so for the people who inevitably take the time to comment about my pronunciation, allow me to go ahead and respond to you all preemptively by simply saying, yes, people in different parts of the world say things differently than you. Truly crazy stuff. Anyways, Shodan has actually been masquerading as Polito, and as you'll no doubt uncover throughout your time with the ship if you're actually listening to and reading all the audio logs as you go about your business, the Von Braun on its maiden voyage received a signal from a nearby planet called Tau Ceti 5. It turns out that in System Shock 1 on Citadel Station, when you ejected the garden as part of the main story there, which is where biological experiments taking place on the ship had been conducted by Shodan, and after floating through space for about 30 years, they crash-landed on Tau Ceti 5, which also just so happens to be the module in which a component of Shodan was left alive and forced into hibernation. When the people from the Von Braun descended to the planet, they found both the Mini as well as a data disk containing what is left of our favorite AI here. Having brought both of them back onto the ship, things start getting bad very, very quickly as the Mini is in possession of a sort of telepathy that can force people to do what it wants via its hive mind situation, which allows it to ultimately take over not only the ship, but also the ship's normal AI, Xerxes, which, due to all the restrictions that took place after System Shock 1, was only ever allowed to be extremely rudimentary in comparison. But with the sort of help of the Mini, it has effectively locked down the ship, and what we need to do is then get Shodan access to the rest of the ship in order to fight not only the Mini, but also see what can be done to stop what is clearly a not great AI from taking over as well. It's a really interesting story. It was fun all the way through, and while I would say the graphics don't really do it justice today, there is like a sort of survival horror element to it. Again though, not a terribly long game. First run was about 13 hours for me at least, and 10 to 15 seems to be about the average for most people anyway. But I liked this story for quite a few reasons. For starters, you have to work alongside this AI that terrorized you throughout the first game. And what's more, the reason for you waking up not knowing where you are is because, at Shodan's behest, you were essentially knocked unconscious, had your memory wiped, and you were fitted with an illegal cyber neural interface, which is what is allowing you to do all of this stuff, effectively making you like one of those cyborgs from the first game as well, but obviously a bit more advanced. So that's a really interesting position just to be in narratively, but they actually take it a step farther towards the end in the sense that I think they do a good job of showing that Shodan is very, very fallible, despite being this super intelligence. In fact, her core mistake 2 games in a row is fundamentally underestimating human beings, that she thinks them truly the insects she claims them to be, which results in her undoing when it turns out that they're often a lot more capable than she gave them credit for, which for 2 games in a row is gotta be a little embarrassing for some super AI, you know? Especially since if she didn't hate humans so much, she could simply take advantage of the fact that she made a decent connection with one and was able to work with them through this entire ordeal, only to inevitably betray you at the end, which was easily the most predictable thing about the entire story, of course. But all that to say, I really thought it was an interesting narrative. It is really engaging the entire way through, and in fact, I think they do probably a better job of explaining this narrative and hitting some of the plot beats in System Shock 2 here. This one is a little more linear than the original, like there are open levels and you can explore the ship as you please, mind you, but most of these levels do a much better job of sort of funneling you towards what your objective is anyway. So even if you're not necessarily sure about where to go or what to be doing, a lot of times just the general flow of the level will kind of put you where you need to be in most cases, which I thought was a nice touch and probably speaks to the level design back then if anything else. Pretty cool experience overall though. Moving along a bit, now let's talk progression. So progression in a game like this is largely down to knowledge as well as your literal player progression, but knowledge is a really big part of this. Simply because there are often things like codes to open doors, or you need to know where to go when you have to figure that out. And once you've done that once and you do know those things, it becomes incredibly easy to do them a second time. Which is why, to reiterate, I do think your first playthrough of this is likely going to be the most impactful, because afterwards you can utilize all that knowledge to do things like get through impossible relatively easy once you know like enemy positions and whatnot. But outside of knowledge, there's also more tangible progression, primarily in the form of cyber modules. You can find these usually as a reward for exploration or finding secrets in hidden areas, that kind of thing, but also simply by hitting story objectives. Shodan will give these to you, and you can then spend them at the various upgrade stations you'll find around the individual maps. Now, these are divided up into your stats, your weapons, tech, as well as psionics. Now, stats are pretty straightforward. You have a bunch of character stats that affect things pretty much what you'd expect, strength, endurance, cyber affinity, your psi ability, that stuff. And basically these stats in combination with your skill in the associated skills is going to make you better at them, which can do things like increase your health, make things deal more damage, that type of stuff. Pretty much what you would expect. Now the catch there is your stats, while useful, are a little bit limited in the sense that you also usually have to have the skill to do the thing you're trying to do anyway, such as the inability to use certain weapons unless you have the minimum skill requirement to do so. There's standard weapons, energy weapons, heavy weapons, and then later on you can get some more exotic weapons. And in order to use any of these, you have to have the appropriate minimum skill level. Unsurprisingly, probably standard as well as heavy tends to be a really convenient way to go. Exotic is tricky to work with because in order to use most exotic weapons, you not only need the skill, but you also have to be able to research them to know what they are and how to use them anyway. The research skill under the tech tree requires you to have certain minimums in order to research the various alien artifacts you find and determine how best to use them. In some cases, that results in just plain old damage buffs, which is crazy good, and in other cases lets you determine what something is, like those exotic weapons, as mentioned. Some of the more integral skills, though, are things like hacking and repair. Modify was really useful, but hacking is essentially required. There's actually multiple places throughout the game that you are required to hack things, including the final boss fight. This means that essentially, to some degree, everybody wants at least a little bit of hacking skill. Repair is just generally useful because weapons can break down on you, and that's going to get old real fast, and repair is going to, of course, help you mitigate that. First, by letting you fix broken weapons and restoring them to poor condition, and then you can use actual repair kits you find to bring their condition up to where they're not constantly breaking on you every other shot, which can get annoying. And that means, essentially, that not building for that is not a good time, frankly. And before I move on to psionics, I did just want to kind of point that out. While they do a pretty good job of offering you a variety of ways to play, there are a couple of these skills that feel pretty non-negotiable. And while, yes, there are technically some workarounds here and there, like the required hacking and the very last boss fight can be circumvented by finding items that will automatically hack things for you, but there's only like 4 of those in the game. And if you use them on some other stuff, not realizing how important they are, and then don't have the hacking skill for that final boss fight, you're setting yourself up for a real bad time. Luckily, the game's pretty short though, I suppose. And I'm not exactly a huge fan of that. Now, something that can help you overcome some of these shortcomings is the variety of psionic powers. So, this is pretty much what it sounds like, psychic abilities. There are 5 tiers to this. I would say the 5th tier doesn't have super useful stuff. Like, there's a couple things in there you'll need to do for achievements, to be frank, but otherwise, most of the good stuff goes up to rank 4, which is going to get you things like the basic telekinesis power, which is super helpful, all the buff abilities you'll probably want in order to help you get by certain things, or in the 4th rank, you actually get a skill that turns you invisible, which only the last boss can see through. And that combined with I believe it's tier 2 or 3 power called localized pyrokinesis, is an AoE you can slap on yourself that deals fire damage to everything around you. And then if you put that on before turning yourself invisible, you can just kill things without ever being in danger at all. So that's a really overpowered combo. So Psionics offers a really, really interesting way to play the game. And the sort of catch there is you are a little bit limited in its use by your Psi power. As your Psi rank or your Psi affinity goes up, you will get more Psi points to use, and the higher tier powers obviously cost more to cast. But the catch is that doesn't refill naturally. In order to refill it, you've got to fill it up with Psi hypos, or just like little mana boosts if you want to put it that way, in order to give you more options for casting. So even there, you're limited a little, so it's not exactly a catch-all. Overall, though, yes, there's a large variety of ways to play this game in the terms of progression, and that's without even talking about all the weapons, which can do all sorts of crazy stuff. But probably owing to its age, though, some of that stuff is a little more required than I would have preferred. Otherwise, there is also some other gear that you can pick up, such as the ability to equip essentially like a suit of armor, which can just add to your defense and make you take less damage, or protect you from radiation hazards, that kind of stuff. One of the researchable ones even gives you extra Psi rating. And you can also utilize implants. Implants, however, are charged by interacting with charging stations, which will also recharge your energy weapons. Meaning that once they lose their charge, as it drains while they are in use, those implants stop being effective, which means relying on them for increased stats specifically in order to meet minimums can be a little hit or miss. Just so you know. From there, let's talk about gameplay and combat, as that's all kind of one and the same here. The bulk of what we're doing is, of course, navigating through the Von Braun, fighting enemies as we go, alongside navigating through the various harsh realities of this largely conquered vessel. So, along the way, though, we'll be picking up audio logs to hear about what happened, learning about things on the fly, as well as figuring out where we need to go, which is, I would say, the bulk of the experience, which is why I would so heartily recommend that people go into this largely blind for the first time, because experiencing how all of that comes together and a lot of the little details here and there is really what makes this tick. It's remarkably well done, despite the game's age. In fact, perhaps because of a little bit of my own bias, some things were a little harder than they should have been my first time around, because such things as the game's age, it never really occurred to me that you could just break windows, but you can do that. A lot of times windows will just break. Some of them are unbreakable, but most of them can. Each deck you find yourself on also has a chemical storeroom, and it will have like a manifest in there, so you can just take notes about what chemicals are where, so you don't have to carry them all around as you search for the required chemicals in order to perform your research, things like that. And there's so many just great little things you'll pick up as you go, which are really great for the overall experience. To get a little more into the weeds of it though, most areas you find yourself in will also have like a spawner for you if you die. The catch is you have to activate it before it works. If you die without it being activated, you get kicked back to your last save, which could at most potentially be the autosave when you entered that area to begin with, which might require you to redo a little bit here and there. If you die while the spawner is active, you just respawn there with 15 health points and can be about your ways. So because of this, it is sort of possible to just death zerg your way through something if you're having a really bad time, though that's not generally very necessary. However, you may very well die to things you don't expect, because one thing this game does really well is makes the ship feel dangerous, with a variety of hazards and enemies that ramp up as you move further into the story. So what starts with basic just hybrid enemies that die in 1 to 2 hits starts turning into psionic monkeys, which starts turning into deadly robots, which starts turning into environmental hazards, which then turns into the deadlier versions of the mini and the robots. But what really makes that simple progression work is the things like the careful placement of, say, turrets or just various enemies, utilizing the game's let's say, simplistic version of cover and line of sight in order to deal with them that way. This also does apply to enemies in some way. Due to the game's age, a lot of enemies have trouble dealing with height, meaning that if you can get on a ladder or something and they're slightly above or below you, you can usually tear them to pieces, because you can act pretty much fully on a ladder despite being stuck on a ladder, and they'll be pretty much helpless to do anything about it. In spite of that limitation though, they really did make a lot of use of the 3D space. There's a lot of jumping in and around things, and while it doesn't get too complicated, there's even like some small little jumps you have to make, or some more daring ones if you're really after some good loot as an example. So there's more there than you would expect. But it goes a little bit farther because enemies even here have various weaknesses and resistances, which is probably most easily to explain via things like your bullet types. Enemies will resist or take extra damage from various types of bullets available to you, standard of course being kind of the default, but you can also get things like anti-armor for the robotic enemies or anti-personnel type cartridges for anything with flesh, which is a simple enough system, but they take that one step farther by the fact that most weapons have an alternate fire mode. To keep it simple, the shotgun, as an example, has one bullet or a triple bullet. One of my favorite guns, the heavy weapon fusion cannon, will have a regular or a death mode. The death mode shoots slower projectiles, but they deal a lot more damage, as an example. So there's a lot of fun stuff to get involved in. And then, of course, there's actually putting your skills to use. Research and stuff that I've already mentioned. You can also modify your weapons to give them upgrades like extra ammo capacity, damage, that kind of thing. You can do this automatically by finding certain upgrades that will do it for you, or utilizing the modify skill in order to do it yourself. But things like modifying, repairing, hacking all make use of this little mini game where you have to light up 3 nodes all in a row, with you having a chance of success per node is my understanding of it, based on things like your skill and whatnot. Now the catch is, if you fail a red highlighted node, you'll set off a security alarm, because security is something you have to worry about. There are security cameras as an example, and if you trigger the alarms, Xerxes will send out enemies to, of course, come find you, or you'll have to find a security console and turn that alarm off so they stop getting sent after you. And while I could go on and on about this stuff, and kind of have already, the main thing I want to get across here is that System Shock 2, despite its age and everything, is really just densely packed with systems in a way that makes this such a unique and fun experience that is really something to enjoy and experience for yourself all these years later. But that does come with a couple of caveats. The weapon repairing system gets old. These weapons will lose their condition so fast, it's ridiculous. And it also means if you haven't put skill into those skills, you're going to have a bad time just trying to fight things because your weapons are constantly breaking on you, which is why it feels so mandatory. Especially since melee weapons, well, I mean, technically you can do it, but it's not very fun. Almost certainly going to die a lot more. And then there's other stuff, like just the fact that it's an old game does lend itself to some awkward controls here and there, like in order to trigger your heads-up display in your inventory and stuff, you have to switch to a different mode that keeps the rest of the game running, and then kind of like opening and closing that all the time can just get a little awkward, the stuff with the ladders that I mentioned. So it's not like a perfect experience, to be clear. It is a remaster of an old game, and while there have been quality of life improvements, some of that more annoying stuff is definitely still in there. Which does bring us to our Steam Deck section. This remaster is in fact verified on the Steam Deck, and yeah, it all works. There's really not much else to say. It's a very old game, so obviously the Steam Deck system can handle it, and with the things the remaster does add to it, like, you know, the improvements for modern systems and everything, it's a pretty good experience over there. Perfect way to experience something like this, especially given the shorter nature of the campaign anyway. More than a viable way to play the game. Might have to mess around with some of the controls to get them comfortable, but that would probably be about it. Moving on from that to positives, negatives, and then wrapping this thing up. So on the positive side of things, this game is such a fantastic experience just overall. I'm actually really glad I went through this and kind of again filled in one of those knowledge gaps of mine, because despite the older nature of the games I play oftentimes, I was 6 when this game released. But even playing it all these years later, I can definitely see why people were taken with it. It was very clearly ahead of its time, and that overall experience they've crafted here is really something that holds up. And then there's the obvious stuff like making that run and play better on modern systems via the remaster itself. Very clearly a lot of stuff to enjoy there. However, on the negative side, this is mostly just the stuff that is still here because of the nature of this remaster, trying to keep that core experience as true as possible. And this is stuff like all those janky mechanics I mentioned, the fact that I'm constantly having to repair weapons and stuff, the skills that feel more like a requirement than an option, that kind of thing. I definitely see why they did not touch any of that stuff, but it must be said, it's definitely kind of a dampener on the experience here all the way in 2025. But that does bring me to my conclusion. So, the System Shock 2 25th Anniversary Remaster here is launching for $30 US, and for that price, I think you're getting a fantastic entry point into a title that has really shaped a lot of iterations, especially in like the immersive sim genre. And if you want to jump into it and experience what that's all about for yourself, which holds up really well, I think $30 for this remaster seems to be a fair price for that, especially with all the work around getting things like the multiplayer up and working. And I did actually want to mention that at least some of that does seem to be the result of works of like modders and stuff over the last couple of decades, and sort of baking them into the previous releases as well as this remaster. And it was really cool to experience all that stuff and all the passion that has been poured into this game by people over the years. And hopefully, with this being a much more accessible way of approaching System Shock 2, even more people will be able to experience just that. Because honestly, this was cool as hell. I loved it. Obviously gets a buy. But by all means, let me know how you feel about it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.